Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for information and education to inspire collaboration and action on all things related to sustainability. With me, Nigel Lake in New York, and my co-host Paul Herman in Paris. We have a great discussion coming up today about the electrification of the built environment. And of course, we're talking about decarbonizing almost every aspect of our society over time. And an awful lot of the energy use and materials use takes place in cities. And so the decarbonization of cities and the electrification of cities is incredibly important. But before we dive into that, first we have this month's Green Jobs Report. So I will hand over to Paul Herman and Amir Khalegi to take us into what has been happening with green jobs. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Nigel. Great to be with everybody. Thanks for joining us today on ESGX. I'm Paul Herman, based here in Paris, France. And Amir Khalegi is in Salamanca, España, in Spain today. So we are both coming to you late night from Europe. Amir, exciting month for green jobs again. Tell us all about it, because it seems like one of the innovations you've brought to it is to show how the unemployment rate might be lower for sustainable jobs than for unsustainable jobs.
Yeah, super excited for this month's presentation. As a reoccurring theme, we always talk about how greener jobs in greener industries have a trait of being more resilient to job loss. And from our analysis that we will show by unemployment rate, you'll see that, green jobs are yet again more resilient. So let's get started. Is everyone seeing my screen? Perfect.
Yes.
So for those of you joining us for the first time, the Green Jobs Report provides data-driven insights on greening the economy. Our analysis is based on human impact plus profit ratings, which is based off 7 pillars of health, wealth, earth, equality, trust, and management practices. We provide an in-depth analysis of over 2,000 HIP-rated companies, which are cross-mapped to industry data, which is provided by the Current Employment Statistics Survey, which provides metrics like employment and wages, hourly pay. Once cross-mapped, we're able to provide a weighted industry HIP rating, and they are placed into 3 buckets, which include green, slightly extractive, and extractive. So one thing that we have found consistently over our 2 years of reporting on green jobs is that jobs in greener industries are more resilient to job loss. What we're viewing here is the unemployment rate by industry greenness. And we can see that from the onset of COVID-19 around March 20th to April 20th, the extractive industries had around a 35% unemployment rate as compared to the national average of 15%, while green industries sat around 7% unemployment. And then as we can see here, extractive industries have remained the highest in unemployment when compared to slightly extractive and green industries. And currently, green industries is around 3% or 2% below the national average. So once again, just showing the resiliency and the ability for greener jobs to adapt to changing conditions within the economy presently. So as we can see too, jobs in greener industries have also recovered the fastest. What we're looking at here is the cumulative percent difference from the February 2020 level employment. In February 2020, we had around 129.7 million jobs in the private sector. Currently, we're around 2 million below, but green jobs are the first to recover over their the February 2020 employment level, followed by slightly extractive, and then in last place, the extractive industries. An additional analysis that we had done is looking at the high contact versus low contact industries. High contact industries were heavily affected by the COVID-19 recession, and still have the majority of job loss is still within the high contact industry sectors. So currently, high contact industries are around 2 million below the February 2020 level, but low contact industries are actually above the February 2020 level by around 400,000. But in high contact industry sectors, greener industries or greener jobs were faster to recover. So what we're looking at here is this green bar here is the high contact industries that were above 30. And we can see that even in high contact industries, they're closer to recover to the February 2020 level. And then when switching over to the low contact above 30, we're almost 1 million above the February 2020 level. But when looking at the below 30, we can see that they are the furthest from their base level of February 2020 employment.
And what that means when we talk about electrifying buildings today, that's a key aspect to a company being more sustainable. And so companies are more sustainable in their products, but also in their built infrastructure. So, and those companies that have stronger built infrastructure typically have, when they rent out those buildings, have lower vacancy rates and higher rents. So it's a better return on investment.
So additionally as well, we did an annual calculation of wages using CES data and hourly data from the CES survey. And what we had found and consistently found is that greener industries pay more. So on an annual basis, green industries pay on average 80,000, which is almost 30,000 above slightly extractive and way above extractive industries. At an hourly rate, extractive industries pay around $27 an hour. Extractive is around 30, and greener industries are at 45 an hour. Along with that, there's a larger difference because greener industry jobs on average provide more stable weekly hours as compared to slightly extractive and extractive. Off the top of my head, the average weekly hours for greener industries sat around 35 hours per week. Slightly extractive was around 33.5, whereas extractive industries sat around 30. Along with providing a better annual wage, there was the greatest wage growth was from greener industries as well. Looking over the past decade, we can see that green industries is around 46% wage growth since January 2010. Slightly extractive is around 44.8%, whereas extractive industries is around 34%. There's this bump here where slightly extractive was able to overtake, but this was the portion where employers were starting to have to pay a premium to get employees to come back. So there was a great wage growth in slightly extractive industries, but green industries were able to overtake for the later part of January or the later part of 2021. So all this being said, are we building back better from the COVID-19 crisis and onset recession? We can see that the HIP rating for the economy was actually highest during the height of the pandemic because the extractive industry jobs were the first to go. Therefore, the HIP.Ness of the economy actually grew, but as we decline in unemployment, we can see that rather than building up or becoming stagnant and maintaining this level, we're actually building back to more extractive jobs. And as we advocate for this report, month after month, for advocating for the benefits of building back towards a greener economy.
So this is super insightful as usual, Amir. Thanks for explaining it so clearly. We can see that unemployment is near back to pre-COVID levels. And there is a slight elevation in the sustainability of the economy. But if you look at the scale on the left, it's still way below 50 on a scale of 100. So to be in the economy today, many businesses are negative impact. So the goal of what you just saw, of what we all just saw today, is greener jobs pay more. They're more sustainable, especially during a crisis. They're usually part of companies that are more sustainable, who treat their workers better. Those companies are actually investing in sustainable buildings, whether they be green roofs, more sustainable infrastructure. Healthier buildings actually are healthier for employees. So people are sick less and take less work days off when they're all together. So really excited to transition from this green jobs analysis. So thanks very much, Amir, especially reporting in from Spain on your vacation. And so I want to welcome the panel about electrifying buildings. Let's go to the next stage. Over to you, Nigel.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Paul. And I think that discussion prompted some really interesting thoughts for me about the longer term challenges if you don't build back better, as lots of politicians talked about it and we are failing to do. And this, if we have time right at the end, I might come back to that and share a couple of thoughts from some work we've just published in Australia, which demonstrates that if you have a backward-looking economy, it does really terrible things for all sorts of things, including your stock market. But first of all, this is all about cities and the role of cities. And of course, cities are where a lot of energy is used. It's where a lot of emissions take place. It's where a lot of opportunity is created. And it's also where a lot of inequity emerges too. And so, if you are a city that wants to decarbonize, where do you start? What does it mean? And who better to help us explore that topic than Katie Van Dyke from the city of Berkeley in California, who has been leading efforts on exactly this. So Katie, please do join us here on our digital stage. Thank you so much for being with us. And the starting question for you is, where did you even start as you said, okay, we want to tackle this problem? Where did all that begin?
Sure. Thanks so much, Nigel. Thanks for having me. So the city of Berkeley has for a long time been kind of a leader in climate change from both the community that we serve as well as from our leadership. So City Council passed a referral saying that Berkeley is going to be a fossil fuel-free city as soon as possible. And that was kind of our marching orders to figure out how do we do this from all standpoints. So buildings, transportation, waste, how are we going to do this? And then from the buildings perspective, we addressed new construction through a prohibition on connecting natural gas to new buildings, which was passed a couple of years ago. So that sort of addressed from a policy standpoint, how are we going to make sure we decarbonize our new buildings? And so then looking at our existing buildings was kind of the next step for us. And so I was fortunate enough to work with Ryan Gardner, who we also have, and some other really wonderful team members to try and figure out how do we do that, not only as fast as possible, but also in an equitable way to make sure that we are transitioning all of the buildings for all of our people, especially those who have been, burdened the most historically. So that was really kind of where it came from.
And what brought the issues of equity and inclusion into the spotlight?
I mean, it's always been a value and priority of Berkeley to advance equity and particularly racial equity. As we embarked on this project, we included, in the RFP, as even when we were starting out, we knew we wanted to take that approach. We've been doing some other work at the city as well for our mobility roadmap that also had an equity focus, and we wanted to kind of continue that work and grow it. And so we knew we wanted a team that could bring equity and bring knowledge and expertise and be able to coach us and guide us to make sure we did things the right way and held us accountable too, to make ssure it wasn't just checking the box, but really make sure we're doing it differently. And then we had this wonderful team. We had the Ecology Center, who is our local and a local nonprofit with deep connections into our communities to help guide us. And I'd say as we started the contract and as we started this work, COVID hit not too shortly thereafter. And then not too shortly thereafter, there was the murder of George Floyd. And so, you know, the whole world was going through so many things. And we as a team were experiencing all these things along with it. But it really made it more important than ever to make sure that we were staying true to that goal of really putting equity first. And so I think, you know, I feel very, very fortunate for our team and I feel that we learned a lot and really tried to stay true to that.
I think that's fascinating, and you know, we started, as it happens, the ESGX Live journey almost exactly 2 years ago. It's our 2-year birthday in a few days' time, and I think one of the lessons that has come up from almost every discussion on a host of topics has been there are issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion almost everywhere. And even if you think they're not there, then if you stop and pause and talk to someone who's involved in trying to drive the changes, they will frequently leap right into the center of the frame. And they become a really important part, I guess for me, not just about doing the right thing, because it clearly must be the right thing to treat the entire community equitably, but actually getting these projects airborne in the first place. And I know we were talking beforehand, you commented a little bit about the issues of building trust with the community, because often, you know, governments and other organizations that may be trying to drive change may not be the most trusted people in the community. Hopefully they are, but they're not always that's not always the case. So how did that trust piece play into this?
So I would say that it's still an ongoing story, and I would say that cities are definitely not the most trusted entities. We are, you know, governments have historically been responsible for creating the inequities that exist and sustaining them and perpetuating them. And so there are many reasons why there is distrust in the community, and I absolutely understand that. But in terms of how we approached it is we worked with the Ecology Center, who basically created our community engagement plan, and we really trusted them and let them run with it. And they basically were able to connect with community organizations that represent disadvantaged communities. They helped identify who are the stakeholders, who are the voices that we need to hear that we aren't traditionally hearing. They had one-on-one conversations with them without the city, recognizing that we are not always a trusted entity. And, you know, I was very eager wanting to make relationships and start to meet people, but I was told very frankly that, you know, it's not appropriate yet. And when the time is right, then we will bring you in. And so in the cases where we were able to, you know, build that trust, and there was interest from the other parties to have the city in the room and start developing a relationship, then we did that. But that wasn't the case for all community organizations for lots of reasons. And so I'd say, you know, we made some really good progress with some of our community organizations. But we have so much more work to do. There are so many others that we have not been able to connect with that we'd like to. So I'd say this is, you know, we did a lot of good work, but we have much more to do.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder that everything around sustainability is a team sport. It's very hard to drive any of these changes without a collaborative approach. And as you've said, you know, no matter how sincere you may personally be, there are often issues that you have to deal with in building trust with the relevant communities, and we all just have to keep an open mind as to how best to do that. And that's probably a really neat segue to bring in Ryan, of course, who with Rincon Consultants has been a big part of this journey with you. And of course, anything like this starts with an RFP. So my question for Ryan, first of all, was, you know, when this RFP came across your desk, or in the Zoom here, of course, across your email, what got you excited about it? What really got you fired up and made you so enthusiastic to get involved with this initiative?
Yeah, we at Rincon we're working on a lot of climate action plans in California, and we recently saw that California had adopted this long range target of carbon neutrality by 2045. And we were really starting to grapple with what that meant and how on earth we could get to such an aggressive target in a relatively short amount of time when we're talking about infrastructure and big changes like that. And along with that, we had another legislative change with SB 100, which required 100% carbon-free electricity by 2045. And with those two pieces, the light bulb really went off for us that building electrification was like a no-brainer at this point, because anytime you take something off of natural gas or diesel and move it to electric, it's just automatically going to be carbon-free by 2045. And it became really clear to us that cities needed to go in this direction. And Berkeley was really the first city to come up with a new building electrification ordinance, which makes a ton of sense. It costs less to build all electric, and they really pioneered that. So when we saw this opportunity to dig into the existing building space, which is much more complicated, all new buildings are kind of the same. They're all being built off the same code, but all existing buildings have been built over the last 100+ years in Berkeley. So they're super variable. It was just we knew it was going to be a really big deal for the rest of the state, and we knew it was going to be really challenging. So it was exciting to get the opportunity to work with a really progressive community on a really important topic.
And to go straight to this issue of equity and inclusion, how did that fold into the project at the beginning? From your point of view, how did that influence how you responded to the RFP? How did it shape some of the early discussions?
Yeah, we knew that coming in, we work in Berkeley fairly often. We've got offices nearby in Oakland. Like, we kind of know the community, but really didn't feel like we had deep enough roots there to have these conversations. And what we needed was a more trusted community partner who's been there, who's part of the community, who knows all of the different groups that we wanted to talk to. And the Ecology Center just jumped out as being really having all of those characteristics. They've been around forever. They started curbside recycling. They're just a pretty legendary group. And we reached out and kind of talked to them about how important we thought this was going to be, and they were on board. So I think, the team structure was key to being able to have those conversations. And without Mina and Danae, who's actually on the line as well, we just wouldn't have been able to get that deep in with having good conversations with the community. And those conversations, it was I came in knowing that cost was going to be a big deal. But when we started talking to the community, there were so many other things that I would not have thought of on my own that are big impacts. There's the number of units that are kind of off the radar affordable housing. Someone has a spare room in their basement that is not permitted and people live there. And if you start going in and doing these big upgrades, how many of those would get removed or kind of phased out? And that was a really significant concern for people. So things that we, in a million years would not have thought of, just starting off looking at how much it costs to electrify. So that was able to bring those conversations in. And I think that has gone a good couple steps of the way to build trust between the community, because they saw their comments were fleshed out in our report and in our plan.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, because I can imagine, and I'm interested in Katie's views on this. When you start down a pathway like this, then the natural thing in the world of government is to try to figure out, where are you going to get the best return on your investment? Where's the benefit cost ratio going to be the most attractive? Because that gives you the best return on your money in the simplest way. But doubtless, if you do that, you're going to end up concentrating the change in areas where perhaps you will just accelerate or increase the amount of inequity. So I'm fascinated, how did you approach essentially prioritization as to where you were going to invest? Because I would guess that the simplest traditional metrics would not be your friend in trying to get to an equitable plan.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just starts with recognizing that the systems that are in place, the processes that are in place are not equitable, and just knowing that and owning it and recognizing that we just have to do this a different way. And, you know, with the guidance that we were able to get from Danae at Ecology Center, and, you know, we had some other support too. You know, they were really able to help us. I think it was really just trying to ask the right questions, make sure that we're doing things differently, constantly asking ourselves who benefits, who burdens, and who's left out from any of the decisions that we were making or any of the policies that we were designing. And it's such an iterative process. So always collaboratively working together, going back and forth. We were always learning new things too. So it was just a very dynamic process. But I think it really did just start with recognizing that we have to do this differently. Like, what we've been doing is not working. What we have been doing has just created this completely inequitable, you know, world. And so how do we do it differently? And luckily our team, our group was very, you know, was very open to that and wanted to do it differently. So we were really able to kind of try and shift the conversation a little bit and shift the process. And I think we really did try to do that.
And so I'm interested in other practical examples of where these challenges came about. So, you know, Ryan gave the great one of, you know, you start electrifying accommodation and you discover there's a series of pieces of accommodation that are, well, they're on the power grid, but they're kind of off the map in terms of what you think you're dealing with. What are some of the other practical examples of where there have been challenges to overcome, and how have you addressed those? And, you know, I don't know if Katie or Ryan's better placed to answer that, or both of you.
I can definitely go into the the technical side of electrification and how the challenges there and where the opportunities are. But I think one piece of information, like data, that really kind of just blew my mind as far as the difficulty and the inequality that some communities have faced in Berkeley and other cities like throughout the country. But areas that were historically redlined in the city of Berkeley, so like didn't receive loans and mortgages and investment, you know, decades and decades ago, we could still see in the data that it was less cost effective to electrify those buildings because of the size of them, the age of them, when the last time they had work done, and just how much electricity they use. So these areas that were underinvested in, that has carried through all the way to today. And even today, in a fresh set of data, you could literally pick out the areas that have been redlined based on the cost effectiveness and the payback period that you would expect from electrification. So like Katie was saying, it's like, if we want to electrify the entire city, that means every building, even those that are going to be potentially less cost effective. So you can say, okay, we're just going to start with the large single family homes that use a ton of electricity and have giant HVAC systems because they're most cost effective. Or you can say those guys are kind of on their own because it's already cost effective and they have plenty of resources to do so, and focus your resources on the places that don't have those resources and have kind of actively been hosed in the past as far as getting investment and getting access to capital.
That's super interesting. And Katie, are there any examples you wanted to add? Because I think these practical issues are just, I think they're really thought-provoking for people, because often you don't quite think of them, and once it's been put in front of you, you think, how could I possibly not have thought about it?
Yeah, and I'm so glad that Ryan brought up that data point, because you know, that's something that was just a huge lesson from us, is that you really have to be intentional with equity all the time, even when you're doing your technical analysis and your cost analysis. So we learned that through our modeling, which is not something that you would generally have as a takeaway when you're doing your financial modeling. But in order to do things differently, that's just, again, why I appreciate our team that, that was modeling that RMI did, really to make sure that you're putting equitable considerations in every piece of it, is something new that, it shouldn't be new, but it's something that I think, we just need to be doing more of. And then in terms of, for Berkeley, there's a lot of like just physical challenges to the electrification of our existing buildings. As Ryan mentioned, we have a very old building stock. We have a lot of knob and tube wiring, which is very expensive. We have very high labor costs, which is, in some ways a very good thing, because we really want to encourage high road jobs, so higher paying jobs that can sustain family and have a career ladder built in. And so, but these are all the things that we're dealing with. And we also have very high energy costs and a mild climate. So all of those things made it very challenging from a financial perspective to make it pencil out as well as in other areas. Yeah, so those are some of the challenges there. And then I'd say also, we have a lot of work to do in the kind of community education side and contractor education side. So making sure that people know about electrification and the benefits. And so it's not some scary thing that people are coming down and taking away your gas stove, but, really trying to take the time to educate people and make sure that that's not the first time they're hearing about electrification is because there's some mandate coming down. That's going to take time. So those are some of the things.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think both of you have alluded in here to some of the challenges related to technology and gathering data. And I think that's something we might come back to shortly. But I wanted to bring in Patricia Pino, who joins us from London. And of course, these challenges are not remotely unique to California or the US. I suspect you've been listening to this and smiling at some of the very familiar problems. And of course, a lot of this is about data and engineering and trying to get to practical solutions to the problem. So maybe just to start, we'll be fascinated to hear a little bit about the type of work you've been doing with maybe a practical example or two of the, what those projects have looked like and what your contribution has been.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. Yes, so in the UK, we have a very strong engineering consultancy sector, and I have been working for the last 15 years with in sustainability departments or just built environment sector on the performance-based sides of buildings, anything that has to do with occupant well-being, occupant comfort, but also with a view of reducing the energy consumption of buildings. So this could mean maximizing the amount of natural ventilation that a building uses throughout the year for offices, or this could mean ensuring that there is a certain amount of air quality to make sure that airborne transmission of diseases is less likely. Or this could also mean more fancy projects like air conditioning in the stadia, and as a result of that, having to minimize the amount of wind ingress into the bowl of the stadia in order to ensure that the cooling system is as energy efficient as possible. So those are the types of projects that I've been involved in. And in the UK, consultancies are primarily focused on serving the private sector. And many, I'm glad to say that many private developers and architects do generally care deeply about implementing technologies that are conducive to environmental sustainability. And they generally do care about social value and occupant well-being. For their side, engineers, I believe they have a fairly good understanding of the options available to them and how to implement those according to the nature of the project in a way that makes efficient use of real resources. So if we have clients that care on the one side and engineers who understand the problems and the solutions, it really, it makes one question, why is then decarbonization progress so slow, and why is adoption of electricity so slow? And I think the problem is multidimensional, but it really, the key issues are really inappropriate legislation and inappropriate economic policy with, I believe, an over-reliance on market solutions. So there is at central government level, there is a slow recognition of reduced CO2 carbon footprint of electricity. So they're still working under the assumption that electricity comes mostly from fossil fuels. which has changed dramatically over the last 10 years, and they have just beginning to kind of incorporate that. It's also related to lack of investment and support from government. So the cost of upgrading local electricity grids, for example, is often left to the developer itself, which makes abandoning fossil fuel an expensive option for them. And then also it's related to the profit motive. Adopting more expensive sustainable solutions is often very costly. And is also related to the stratification of investment. The over-reliance on market solutions means that investment mostly goes to places that already enjoy a high level of quality of life and amount of wealth. So sadly, most of the more innovative solutions that I've been involved in go into the places like the City of London, where all
I was going to ask about exactly that, which is that it feels like there's a very large but hanging over all of this, which is, and you shared a couple of pictures before, and I was going to put up this one, which looks like a lovely development. And I think this is the City of London, if I recognise some of the buildings here. But of course, they're very shiny buildings and they're very expensive buildings. And I guess the question, I'm going to maybe get all three of you to provide an answer to this in your own frame. What's the solution to the basic problem that there is it's easy to justify some of these solutions if you're building very fancy buildings. And of course, as an owner of these buildings, they'll get nice green star ratings and they'll be more highly valued. So you've probably got quite a simple business case if you're building a very fine office tower in a major city centre. But how do you drive a different approach across an entire portfolio? I don't know, maybe start with Ryan. Have you got a view on that?
I can get myself unmuted here. Yeah, I mean, I think there's one of the nice things about electrification, if we're talking new construction, right? And these are like, you got to keep these so separate because it's just a world apart as far as cost effectiveness. But in California, and which is where I know best at this point, new building electrification is less expensive than building with mixed fuel. You don't have to plumb natural gas. You don't have to have natural gas meters. The entire thing is faster. I've talked to developers who have saved millions of dollars just in being able to get their projects done faster. So they're not having to pay, interest on their construction loans because they can get construction done so much quicker. So I think a lot of the new construction is just having the education out there so that developers know that this is feasible and that people are going to buy the building still. I think there's still a little bit of hangover from buildings in the 70s that were all electric and were kind of awful to live in because the technology was not very good. But we're getting there. A lot of developers in California already understand how much more cost effective it is. So I don't think it has to be a super, beautiful building in downtown London that gets this treatment. There's other levels to it that we can do everywhere. Once we get into existing buildings, I think it is still cost effective, but the payout is much longer. So the key there becomes funding and financing. So being able to have a low interest financing opportunity. We've been talking a lot about like tariffed on-bill financing or other types of on-bill financing that aren't tied to the direct person, but to a building, can really be a game changer in getting folks, even without capital, access to these technologies, and then you just use the savings to pay out. So a lot of things in sustainability are expensive, and they have been. Electrification seems to be one of those places where I've seen the most opportunity to have like the win-win scenario.
And I think it's a great point because very often this issue comes up that the investments that are required to drive some of these changes are expensive. But one of the big reasons for that very often is it's because you're investing in something which is mostly upfront capex and there's a reduced operating expense going forward. So the total lifetime cost of ownership very frequently significant, or at least moderately, if not significantly lower. And I've got a paper coming out in a couple of months' time which digs into all of this in more detail, and in particular the underlying point that interest rates are really low in the world, and one reason for that is we've got more capital than we've got good places to invest it. And a good place to invest that capital is thus in projects which deliver a low return but a reliable one for a really long period of time, exactly like some of these. So Katie, interested in your views, and also you mentioned a type of wiring which sounded quite horrifying, and I didn't know quite what it was, and it prompts one of the questions in the Q&A as well, which is, the challenges about recruiting and training electricians and other people to drive all of this. And as one example, in China, what China did was they figured out how many roofs needed solar panels across the entire nation, and they calculated how many electrical engineers they would need to install those solar panels over 10 years. And then they recruited 2 million people into that role to fit all those solar panels for 10 years. And they told everybody, we will train you and you're guaranteed a job for 10 years. After that, you're on your own again. But that's kind of easy to do if you're China. But no, America works differently. And so I'm fascinated about how you've dealt with some of those challenges, Katie.
Yeah, sure. And in terms of, so for your first question around how do we make the case, especially around existing buildings, and I think really what we learned, doing our community engagement too, is that, most community members aren't necessarily really that interested in talking about building electrification. They have a lot of other things going on. We were talking to them during COVID. We have a massive housing affordability crisis. People are just trying to feed their families and live their lives. And so what we also have recognized about building electrification is that there are all of these resilience co-benefits. And so that has really kind of been what we're trying to lead with, is the benefits of electrification and how it can, lead to better health conditions, right? Because you're not burning gas in your home. So for families with asthma or in highly polluted areas, that can be a benefit. Under certain conditions and with a lot of dependencies, it could reduce costs. And there's the greenhouse gas benefits, but there's lots of other benefits. So I think that's what we're trying to do in our kind of education and community engagement and outreach, is really lead with that. And in terms of your question around knob and tube wiring, so it's just, as Ryan mentioned, our building stock is really, really old. And so we just have a lot of our homes were built with knob and tube, which can be very dangerous. And so a lot of electricians really recommend getting rid of any knob and tube in the house before they'll even touch it, or before they leave the house, they will remove it all. But in order to do that, you have to rip open your walls, you have to rip open your ceilings. It's very, very expensive. And so a lot of homes have kind of mixed knob and tube. Like my home, for example, is like that, where we have some new and some knob and tube. So it's just going to be a challenge. And I think that's the case for a lot of cities that were built around the same time. That was just the standard. But it leads to this very important question in the chat. Thanks for asking about kind of workforce development and training. And it is very important. There are not right now, probably, there's not enough contractors out there who, know a lot about electrification or doing the work. When I tried to, do renovations on my house, it was very hard to find anyone who knew what heat pumps were or knew how to install them. So we are working closely. We reached out to our unions and other workforce development training programs and other key stakeholders in that area, both locally, and we're also working through a state grant, a High Road Training Partnership grant, to try and have those conversations of how do we bring everyone along together. So it's the electricians and the plumbers, but also talking about the workers who have been in the fossil fuel industry, and how do we make sure that there's a good plan for these folks too, who also need to have good jobs, and how do we make sure these are high-paying jobs. So it's a really important question that we are working together to try and figure out. We don't necessarily have the answer, but we're trying to have those collaborative conversations, and being at the same table together is really helpful.
I think it's a massively important one, and I think there are there are significant challenges ahead, because demand for these people is going to grow significantly. We've seen in the UK, and this is not the same people, but it illustrates the same point. The pipeline of wind projects in the UK has exploded in the last year or so. In Australia, a single state ran an RFP process for a renewable energy zone and attracted 100 billion Australian dollars, so about 70 billion US dollars of would-be investors to those projects. And those numbers surprise people, but is entirely reflective of the experience we've had about the amount of money there is out there trying to invest in these projects. But they take people, they take engineers and electricians and everything else along the way. So coming back to you, Patricia, briefly to ask you, what's your perspective around how we can incentivize different behavior and get more of this type of thinking applied to the buildings that are not the very fancy ones. And before you answer, just a quick request, anyone who's watching on YouTube, please do use the share button, please do use the like button. This helps to get these messages out from our guests to a wider audience. Every time you press that button, 9 extra people watch the video, which is just magic. So, Patricia, over to you. Interested in your perspectives around what really is there something that can be done which will drive a change in behavior?
I think I prefer to think bigger, and maybe it's too big, but we've seen a drive towards cities, and I think we need to question as to whether we're just simply going to accept this kind of movement towards cities and just focus on building within cities, as opposed to tackling the reasons why people are being more congregated, jobs are being more congregated in a few areas. In the UK, there's a huge disparity between London, the whole of London, not just the city of London, but the whole of London and the rest of the UK, and many areas of the UK are largely neglected and have high levels of unemployment. So instead of these fancy buildings in London, of course, are very energy efficient, but they also have a lot of embedded carbon inside. A lot of them are glass boxes. Glass is not a particularly environmentally friendly material. And I think we could make use of existing buildings in other areas that are not seeing a lot of jobs at the moment, and we could refurbish those in much simpler ways, and at the same time as creating employment at local level in other parts of the UK. So I think at the moment, the kind of rush to just build new, sure, it creates fancy new buildings with new technology, but it doesn't. We need to question whether that is actually the most energy efficient, carbon efficient way of, creating good buildings that everybody can enjoy.
Oh, Nigel, you're on mute.
Thank you very much. It was going to happen once, and there it did. So it's a neat reminder of one of the carbon elephants in the room, which, of course, buildings are often built out of concrete. Concrete is the substance man uses most of after water in the world. It's 4.5 billion tons a year of CO2 emissions, and what can we do about this? And late last week, I suspect almost everybody missed it, Heidelberg Cement pushed the go button for a project called Lilac 2, which is 100,000 ton a year carbon capture on the lime manufacturing part of one of its cement plants in Germany. And this is technology which can readily be scaled up to 500,000 ton plus scale, because you just build 5 of these things next to each other. So that is very exciting in that it is carbon-free cement, because not only is the CO2 captured, but the process can be electrified, so you can get rid of the energy emissions from this process as well. And this cement accounts for about 7 to 8% of all emissions globally. So it's a massive, massive thing. So that technology is coming. So the prospect of completely carbon-free buildings is not that far away, and the cost of applying this technology is amazingly low. It's a different design of kiln, which if you're building a new kiln, there's no real incremental capital cost, no incremental operating cost. So some of these changes are coming sooner than we might think, and I very much hope that one of these will be trialed on the West Coast somewhere. So fingers crossed for that one. Well, where next? I know we're getting towards the top of the hour.
I've got a quick
Ryan,
question for Patricia.
far away.
We have a minute. There's a story I read about the transition the UK went through like decades ago from town gas to natural gas, where they essentially had to go through every single building in the country and replace the appliances that used to run on town gas, which had carbon monoxide in it, to work with natural gas. But it was like, you couldn't just swap it out. It was like a complete retrofit of the entire country to use this new fuel type. And I wonder if you had heard about that at all, or I just think it's such an interesting potential case study for what we need to do now to like really go building by building and retrofit every end use that we have.
I mean, that happened during the 1970s, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not massively familiar with it. I've just passingly heard about it. But it goes to show, I mean, a few decades ago, the government used to build a lot of housing itself as well. And that is something that the government is not doing anymore. And but it does show how, you know, how quickly these things can be rolled out when there is political will behind it, and when there is so it's not like these things are not possible. It's just that we've fallen into this mentality of, well, the government shouldn't do anything. It should be left to the private sector, and the private sector has limitations of that the government doesn't face.
Thanks.
Fantastic. And there was a question on YouTube which I wanted to come back to, which was the issue of, if we're talking about electrification and use of batteries, and then of course it raises all these questions about rare earths and other nasties. We did have a discussion last week, so you're probably glad that you're not about to get grilled on battery chemistry, but if anybody wants to talk about it, they're very welcome. But we had a discussion with a business last week, that actually a Harlem-based startup, which has spent the last decade plus developing a battery system, which basically is using a more traditional chemistry. It doesn't have all the nasties in it. And 10 days ago, they finished installing a several hundred megawatt capacity. I think it was 200 megawatts, maybe 400 megawatt hours, something of that order, in a supercomputer center in San Diego. It's being applied for a very sophisticated application. So again, I think for me, the good news here is that some of these technologies are emerging. I don't know, Ryan or Katie, if you want to talk briefly about that sort of issue and what you've grappled with. If you don't, that's absolutely fine, because there's a whole hour on it last week, but there may be something specific to the city of Berkeley.
Yeah, Katie can follow up, but we definitely talked about it. And I think that I don't want to be too hand wavy, but I do think the battery technology is going to come around. And on the other hand, I don't think we have to have it right now. There's some really kind of key applications, especially in California, where we're having a lot of power safety shutoffs because of wildfire risk and wind and all this other crazy stuff going on. And there's also benefits for folks in the disabled community or folks who rely on having power all the time. So there's some benefits we can roll in there. But I think just on the average home, battery storage is a kind of a nice to have, but not a need to have as far as electrification. And there's a lot of kind of grid scale work that needs to be done by utilities as far as using biofuels for power generation to supplement the electric or the solar and the wind. And I think those things are going to come together, and it's sometimes nice to not have quite so many hard to overcome problems all at once, because I think there's a lot of people working on different stuff. So at this point, I think it's nice to have. It's not something you have to make the math work out.
Fantastic. That's really, really helpful to know. Well, I know we're coming towards the end now, so I might just ask you to each offer a quick answer to a popcorn round, which is, what's one thing you would like people to take away today and go and act on? What's the kind of one thing where you just wish this is what you'd like them to do?
I will make a plug for The Switch Is On, is a website that I have been looking through. They've got a lot of great information on electrifying your home. It's probably one of the bigger things you can do to future-proof your home and help improve air quality in your house and reduce your emissions. So it's when your water heater breaks, it's too late because you oftentimes need to do a bunch of extra stuff. So thinking ahead a little bit to what you might need to do to get that done is super important. There's a lot of great incentives out there, and they can help connect you.
And I'll make a plug for doing things differently and making sure that you really are taking your processes, whatever it is, whatever industry you're in, asking yourself who's benefiting, who's burdened, who's left out, what can I do to make sure that the outcomes for the work that I'm doing are equitable, and who can I bring to the table with me to make sure that happens.
Fantastic. And Patricia, how about you?
For me, it would be maybe to encourage the audience to do what they already doing by attending this, which is to, if they're into engineering or sustainable solutions, to also understand the economic kind of limitations behind that, or if you're into economics, to also familiarize yourself with the technological options. And really, I think we need more people to kind of bridge the gap between those two worlds. And the more we encourage people not to work in those kind of two separate silos, the quicker this is going to happen.
Fantastic. Well, that was, I think, a very good discussion. I found it very thought-provoking. So I really appreciate all of your perspectives. As you have each said, this is very much a team sport. So I think we will all continue to walk these paths together. Maybe, Paul, you'd like to join me now, and we'll just do a quick wrap-up of what's coming up next week. As a quick plug for last week, but we talked about electric dreams and the future of EVs and power storage, and one of the guests was Gabriel Counts, talking about some of these battery solutions. So all of our previous episodes are on the website. But Paul, over to you to talk about what's coming up.
Sure, happy to do that. And also, I know there was a little question about rare earths as well, which on the positive contribute to electrification and battery storage and energy storage, yet still are extractive of earth and still need to be optimized in so many ways. So that's sort of a high level answer, and we'll save that for a future show. Coming up is animal-free foods. So we're organizing alternative protein experts and the role of cities, and how to have animal-free foods. So I know many of us on this call, seek to eat in a sustainable way that's better for your health, as well as better for the animals and the environment. And then after that, we have the bioeconomy boom, again, focused on sustainable agriculture. And so to bring in, we have sort of a deep well of sustainable agriculture on the ESGX site too. So we hope you'll be able to do that. And that's during Earth Week. And then, Nigel, is there one more slide, or is that it? So April is
there is another one coming ahead, but I don't have it right here. So if you can remember it, we've got the one about Inside Ohio coming up.
Right, Intel Inside Ohio. So our next Green Jobs report at the end of April will focus on Intel inside Ohio. There's a large plant being built in central Ohio that will help create jobs, help re-anchor the supply chain to not just be international, but also be domestic, and over time help address what's become chip shortages during the pandemic and the roller coasters of our time. So, and there's the video. So want to thank everybody for participating today. Katie Van Dyke of the City of Berkeley, Ryan Gardner of Rincon Consultants, who has been a partner of HIP as well in focusing on climate action plans and how to fund climate action plans, and Patricia Pino, who dialed in late from Europe as well. So thanks Amir Kalegi for joining from Spain on your vacation, and thanks Nick Gower, our producer, and Nigel and I, always trading time zones, but bringing you sustainability from around the world. So please check out the ESGX site for all the recordings, share them with your friends, and on YouTube. So on behalf of ESGX, Nigel Lake in New York, Paul Herman in Paris, we'll see you next time on ESGX.